why Russia did this?
I think things have got much more complicated by social media and the fact that self-publishing costs absolutely nothing nowadays. The most famous lie was when Boris Johnson's camp got a bus and put a sign on the side saying, we pay £350 million a week. So it's not just this part of Europe where politicians lie, or Donald Trump in the United States. It also, populist lies. Putin was then stuck because he couldn't really get out of the situation.
Hi Karen, welcome back.
Thank you.
So I'm glad you have time for us, time for me, because this is something that I wanted to talk about, and who better than a political scientist to talk on this topic which we have. Let me just begin with, and very simply, Karen, has truth in politics always been complicated, or does it feel more confusing today than before? So, for example, we are constantly exposed to narratives and statements through the television, through the social media, and we see different versions of reality. So what do you have to say about that?
I think things have got much more complicated by social media and the fact that self-publishing costs absolutely nothing nowadays. So in the past, there were newspapers and there were radio stations and television stations, and you more or less knew what you could expect from them.
Yeah.
In Western Europe, going back 30 or 40 years, the left used to say, oh, there's a right-wing bias because rich people own newspapers and the establishment, whatever that meant, controls television and radio. But by and large, you knew what to expect. You knew what was a left-wing newspaper and what was a right-wing newspaper. And although they showed different opinions and interpretations, by and large, they didn't tell outright lies. For example, the former British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was once sacked as a journalist for a right-of-centre newspaper for inventing things that weren't true. There was basically respect for truth. In this area of Europe, 40 years ago, the situation was rather different. There used to be a Polish joke, I don't know, it's probably a joke in Slovakia as well.
Go for it.
Why do people read the newspapers backwards? Well, because the sports results are the only things they believe are true. The political stuff, they knew it came from the Communist Party leadership. But even in that situation, there was some degree of certainty. You had an idea what to expect. And I suppose in this part of Europe, people are still slightly more prone to believe conspiracy theories, things that people were saying over the garden fence rather than what was in the newspapers, because in the communist period, what people said informally was sometimes nearer to the truth than what the government was saying. But nonetheless, everything's got more complicated for everyone nowadays. And by and large, if somebody sends me a video and says, oh, this person is really interesting, listen to what they're saying, the first thing I do is to look the person up and see whether they're worth listening to and what I have to bear in mind when listening to them. And I find I quite easily discover, sometimes through Wikipedia, a source we tell our students not to use, I can get the picture that this person has a track record of lying, or this person is known to have established views and this sort of thing. I can check it up, but a lot of people can't check things up. They don't know how on the internet to find a reliable source or an unreliable source. And so you get all sorts of strange videos or blogs getting hundreds, thousands, even millions of likes that are are based on falsehood, based on lies.
Yeah. I want to ask a very conceptual question. Explain to me left wing and right wing in that context.
That's a very good question, because it's very, very noticeable to me as a political scientist that the understanding of left and right in the post-communist world is very different from the understanding in Western Europe. Western Europe, being right-wing means believing in a free economy, in a market economy, and it also means believing in traditional conservative values, being, for example, nationalist or slightly authoritarian. So it's a bit different from left-wing. Left-wing people believe in greater state intervention in the economy, greater state protection of the weaker in society, and the left also believes in defending the rights of minorities. The left in Western Europe supported immigrants, people from ethnic minorities, people from sexual minorities, people with minority opinions. Right. Now, in this part of Europe, it's completely different, because 40 years of communism meant that the so-called left, the communist parties, who ran Central and Eastern Europe and controlled the whole of the economy, were actually also rather conservative in their views. There was virtually no immigration, they controlled the borders tightly, and they never talked about social issues like ethnic minorities or sexual minorities. It was ignored. So generally, you get a different understanding of left and right here. And this is where you get the current dilemma in Slovak politics, where Robert Fico, the Prime Minister, and his Smer party, and also the Hlas party, they both call themselves social democracy, and people think of them as being on the left, whereas Smer, certainly since 2015, in my mind, has been veering to the far right, certainly in its willingness to use racism as a tool for electoral advantage. And so we cannot assume, if we live here, that we know what is meant by left and right, because of course Western European socialists never accepted the system that used to exist here as socialism. We called it Soviet-style communism, and we didn't think it had anything to do with real socialist values.
So and as you see, it can be quite confusing for especially people who do not understand at a deeper level, like you are, if we're not an expert. Because I also believed, and I believe probably when you use the word right wing or rightist versus a leftist, I always connected being right meant more of nationalistic in nature, more populist or propagandist, versus left in associated to more liberal, more democratic.
That's right.
So it's very oversimplifying.
Yes, and the Slovak understanding is absolutely the opposite of that. The Slovak understanding is that left-right refers to the state control of the economy and looking after the economically weak. It doesn't refer to socially liberal values. And so you get the irony here that in Western Europe, generally, all the big cities have left-wing social democratic mayors and the countryside is right-wing, whereas in Slovakia, the so-called right usually gains the capital city, and the so-called left gets votes from older people in the countryside. It's the exact opposite of Western Europe. So there is a lot of confusion with the meaning of left and right here. Right. And to an extent, the age of populism, where you have popular leaders pushing conspiracy theories, has also messed up the left-right divide somewhat.
Yeah. So talking of conspiracy theory, we will move into the topic that I really want to touch today is when politicians lie, right? So we, and we have seen, and I think a good example would be we see a lot of these narratives coming from the current president of America, Donald Trump, and some more names we can think of. When these politicians say something that later turns out to be incorrect, which is obviously has been proven over time to be incorrect and backed by facts, is that always considered in the world of politics and the world of politics science? Is it always considered lying, or is there a gray area in how we should interpret that? Is this how political communication works? Is it normal?
I think the acceptability of politicians lying deliberately has been a big shift. In the past, it was accepted that proving a politician had deliberately lied was a good way of discrediting them. And now we look at Donald Trump, and really, if he says something, it tells you absolutely nothing about reality.
Yeah.
He might be telling the truth, but he has told so many lies that you don't know. And if he says it wasn't the Americans who bombed that school, the statement is meaningless, because you think it's very likely that in a week's time the Americans will be admitting that they did bomb that school. So it's rather difficult, but it's not just a Donald Trump problem. The British are very conscious that huge lies were told during the Brexit campaign in Britain. And the most famous lie was when Boris Johnson's camp got a bus and put a sign on the side saying, we pay £350 million a week to the EU, we will spend it on the National Health Service. It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. It was a lie in numerical terms. It was a lie in terms of what they actually did with the numbers. But the Brexit campaign was unfortunate because the media, the BBC, for example, thought that neutrality was giving the same amount of publicity to both sides in the referendum. And in fact, one side was supported by the vast number of elected members of parliament, and the other side was a weird minority that suddenly got a lot of publicity and won through lies. And so, still in Britain, being written on the side of a bus is now a kind of allusion to telling lies. It means it can be a huge, big lie. So it's not just this part of Europe where politicians lie, or Donald Trump in the United States. It also, populist lies were hugely important for political developments in Britain too.
Interesting. So Karen, in these scenarios, examples, knowing that these statements that the politicians you mentioned and the likes make, and they're so strongly disputed, we still see people supporting them, So, and I'm sure there are so many examples. So, knowing that the leader you follow, the politician you follow, has made a series of statements and comments that have been proven wrong and are being disputed, we still somehow are loyal. The followers are loyal. They are still being supported. Why is that? Like, is it because they follow the leader versus the belief the politics they are representing? How do you explain this?
It's very difficult to explain, and often politicians spend a lot of time trying to prove that their opponent has lied, which is often quite easy to do. But the blatant fact is that the supporters of that politician actually don't care, and that is the frightening issue. It's as if charisma of the politician matters more than anything else. But I think it's fair to say that outside the US, it's very difficult for people to understand that there is still so much support for Donald Trump, particularly when you listen to his speeches. I mean, there's a tendency for radio and television to show 20 or 30-second extracts of Donald Trump speaking, and he's usually saying something rather crazy or inarticulate, and people think it's laughable. If you listen to 5 minutes of his speech, it becomes really alarming, because you just think, well, if this man was an employee, if he worked for a company, they would sack him by saying that, you know, his mental faculties...
On integrity and ethical and mental faculties.
It's actually the mental faculties that clearly, you know, he no longer has the mental faculties to do a job. And that is very, very frightening. And I wouldn't be surprised within the next 10 years if the American Constitution was changed so it didn't just have a younger age limit for the president, but also an older age limit.
And should we be worried that if this is catching up and it sets, if he has set a precedence and this is being more and more acceptable, and somehow with the social media and so much of overload of information, if this becomes a mainstream behavior of a world leader, should the common public like us be worried? Because
it depends. Of course, you've used that awkward word mainstream, which in politics we tend not to use it because it's not clear what it means. But certainly you're right that just saying the first thing that comes into your head, it's difficult to say. Partly it depends a little bit from country to country. Again, Britain, which looked like such a stable democracy, possibly has a huge shift in the party system coming, though we're not sure about that yet. In terms of views, there are signs already that damage has been done, that recent surveys show that men are now more likely to believe that they should have a dominant role in marriage and that women should do what they said, which was an unacceptable view for 30 or 40 years. This is, you know, the opposite has been established. And this is because of the rampant views, the misogynistic views on social media, but also, of course, that people choose what they listen to, choose what they believe, choose what they give their time to. On the other hand, there are moves already to control what is available to teenagers in terms of social media, but that's going to be very difficult to do because of political agreements about what is and isn't acceptable.
So talking of social media now, you see so much of theatrics going on, right? Do you think the politicians engage into these theatrics and melodramatic speeches and videos to distract people from other important issues?
I think it depends on the leaders. To go back to the British case, Boris Johnson was very much an actor. He didn't mind people laughing at him. He was a performer. He was better at performance politics than actually the hard work. Donald Trump appears to be self-obsessed. The word narcissist tends to be overused nowadays, but clearly he's more interested in himself than anyone else, and that is difficult. But I don't think you can generalize about politicians. Mm-hmm. I mean, clearly politicians who perform well and are interesting do well in election campaigns. That's been a problem for 20, 30 years, the presidentialization of politics. But it's very hard to generalize there.
Let's move closer to home here, to Slovakia, and talk a bit about Ukraine, which is very close to our borders. When the war between Ukraine and Russia started, or let's say when Russia invaded
Yes.
Ukraine in 2022, which is not very long back ago, there were narratives, there were discussions, and as always, experts coming on and talking about why Russia did this. So there were a group of people like us who were like, okay, why did this happen? And I would like you to explain to us. We could look at it as whether Putin being, or the history of Russian leaders they are more imperialist, more empirical in nature, and this was an oversimplified assumption that he just wants to, or they want to start with Ukraine and they would like to go on whatever the next country comes next, and which honestly my parents in India were worried in what's going on. So that is one example which is very oversimplified, very conventional way of thinking. The reason why Putin invaded Ukraine is for imperialistic or expansion reason. But the other reason that we heard about was considering the NATO and his concerns around that. What explanation would you like to talk about it? Where should we?
I find that the importance of imperialism is actually understated sometimes in discussion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. West Europeans tend to think of imperialism as being getting in a ship and going overseas and taking foreign countries and controlling them, and Russian imperialism, which was an internal empire where you simply pushed your borders out, is less easily recognizable as imperialism. And I don't, looking at things that Putin has said, I don't have a problem believing that simply he was looking at his legacy in history and he wanted to regain the old Russian imperial lands, and starting with Ukraine. He thought it would be possible because the West had been very accepting of his invasion of Crimea and of the east of Ukraine in 2014. And also he made one huge miscalculation. He thought it would be relatively quick to get to Kiev and put in a Belarusian type friendly government, and Zelensky's, the absolute turning point where I think it was the Friday, the invasion was the Thursday, the Friday, when the Americans were offering Zelensky that they'd take him out because the Russians clearly were going to kill him, and he said, I need weapons, I don't need a taxi. And this is one of these, roles of where agency took over from structure. Agency, what one actor did, turned things. Now, Putin was then rather stuck because he was left with a long war, and the Russian history of having huge casualties and losses in wars meant that that's not quite as unacceptable in Russia as it would be elsewhere, although he does have problems with increasing conscription. But Putin was then stuck because he couldn't really get out of the situation. And although we criticised Donald Trump a lot, one thing we have discovered through Donald Trump's very generous offers to Putin, Donald Trump gave Putin an easy way out. He was actually prepared to allow Putin to keep some of the territory he had stolen from Ukraine in 2022. and Putin just wasn't interested. Putin is not interested in any solution that does not give him a pro-Russian government in Kiev. So we discovered actually that Putin wasn't looking for a face-saving way out of his initial miscalculation. He actually still has the same aim, and there's really no point negotiating. Yeah. The only time that Trump has had any influence at all on Putin is when he's been threatening more weapons for Ukraine and military retaliation against us. Right. It's the only thing that has any effect on Putin. So Trump's now got a bit bored. Trump's a typical bully boy. He'd prefer to, fight Iran or Venezuela than a country like Russia that actually has some military strength. So he's got rather bored of Ukraine. And it's an awful problem, I think, not just for Ukraine, but also for Slovakia, which is bordering Ukraine, that the theatrics of Trump and what's happening now in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz is actually distracting from the continuing dreadful things that Russia is doing in Ukraine. I mean, some of the bombing raids, the drone raids have been absolutely awful, and they're not getting the attention they should have had.
That's what I wanted to transition our conversation to, is how are people in the region, and talking about Ukraine and Slovakia, how are they responding to this versus how globally people are watching this whole scenario, which you just explained now. People close home here, people in the region, or people who are directly impacted, living on both sides of the border, Ukraine and Slovakia. What's the general mindset and how they are dealing with this?
It's very interesting. I mean, the attitude of some Slovaks to the war in Ukraine is rather bizarre for anyone who's British. And these are the people who believe that Prime Minister Fico is somehow supporting peace by wanting a more generous attitude to Putin and wanting to cede to Putin.
Right.
Because the idea that giving in to Putin could have anything to do with peace is not an idea you can sell in Britain, because they immediately produce a photograph from 1938 of the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain standing amongst the crowds on the tarmac at the airport when he flies back from Munich, having met Hitler and betrayed Czechoslovakia, and he waves this piece of paper in the air. He's got a signature from Herr Hitler that, and he called this peace in our times. He actually said peace for our time, not peace, but peace in our time has gone down. And if you talk about making concessions to Putin and bringing peace, the British just look at you, roll their eyes and say, peace in our time. Yeah, we remember what happened when we gave in to Hitler. Within a year, we were putting blackout curtains up at our windows waiting for the bombing raids to come. This is not how you achieve peace. And yet, interestingly, although it was Czechoslovakia that Britain and France betrayed to Hitler in Munich, in Slovakia, part of the population, the pro-Fico population, don't seem to see it like that. It's very, very strange. Because, I mean, Czechoslovakia hasn't forgotten Munich. There's still this term in Slovak, on us, bez nás, about us, without us, people making their decisions about them, foreigners making decisions about them without even consulting them. But I think maybe how it's remembered in Czechoslovakia is different, because in Britain we just have the two images, that, the peace in our times, the piece of paper being waved. The British remember how Neville Chamberlain sold his stupid mistake to the British public. They remember that more than what happened to Czechoslovakia afterwards. So, the idea of peace being achieved by giving in to men or believing men like Hitler Putin, it's just ridiculous to the British.
Interesting. So, Karen, do you think you've been in Slovakia for such a long time and you've seen it evolve? Do you think that people's trust in politics have changed, and are they more divided now versus earlier? Because
I have always regarded Slovakia as a politically very, very divided country. And interestingly, there has very recently been a survey that says that Slovakia is the second most polarized political country in the world, after Argentina, I believe. So I think that there is a big divide in Slovak politics.
okay.
And it is possibly getting worse, because even in the 1990s, when there was also a big divide, the idea that if the EU doesn't want us, we'll, go to Russia, was just regarded as ridiculous. Whereas now, thanks partly to social media and changes in neighbouring countries, the idea that being closer to Russia is not an appalling thing to think about, is much more common than it used to be. It's as if people have amnesia about what it was like here under communism.
So, talking about experts, so as I brought up at the beginning of our conversation that people like us, not an expert in geopolitics or in political science, but with so much of information thrown at our face, with the influx of social media and information everywhere on every topic, when we look at the political environment now, we have so much of information, and a lot of us tend to feel confident about knowing, and versus rather, I get overwhelmed. I'm super confused. I don't know what to make out of it, and I get into research mode. But it looks like from the various forwards and the virality of all the reels and WhatsApp messages, when I see, are we becoming more informed, or are we becoming more overconfident? And what do you think about experts like, we've started to follow or notice some professor, in this case, we see a certain professor of political science, John
Mearsheimer,
Mearsheimer.
Oh, yeah.
So what do you think about all these?
Well, Mearsheimer is an interesting case because, he's a specialist in basically American foreign policy, international relations, and he's being shot to prominence by the conspiracy theorists because he's the only serious American commentator who doesn't support the Ukrainian side, who has more pro-Putin moods, and
he's
suddenly
quite controversial.
He's the source that all the anti-Ukrainian conspiracy theorists quote, because he's the only one, and they think that by quoting one Western political scientist with decent credentials, they've won the argument and forget about the other thousands who say something different. And this is kind of a good example, actually, of how social media works, that you take one person and put them up, and you don't do a balanced survey of all the different sources.
So do you think it's more to do with human psychology and belief, that we tend to believe when experts like I keep forgetting his.
Mearsheimer.
Mearsheimer. John Mearsheimer.
People are only interested in him if they agree with him. And there is a problem in politics that is recognised more, that people tend to seek out information that confirms their existing beliefs rather than looking for a balanced input that might challenge what they believe. People prefer, people gravitate to sources that confirm what they already think and not different sources.
So what do you suggest, Karen, being a political scientist, which is, you come from the academia and you have such a long experience, you have a vast body of work and you've seen all these evolution. What would you suggest? Where do we, at the stage where we are now, where misinformation is key and we are listening to the lies repeatedly, where would you start? And yes, the only source we have are these experts online on YouTube. Is it hard to get the facts checked? Where should we start with? What should we do?
I think the most important thing is to try and educate young people to evaluate the sources they use. For example, I put a question into Google yesterday. It was about a legal issue connected to a change of law in Britain. And I immediately saw that the first AI answer that came up was quoting a Facebook site I use sometimes, and I know there's huge arguments in that Facebook site because half the people on it don't actually understand the law themselves, and AI was using that as a source, whereas it's totally non-authoritative. Some AI answers are very good, some ChatGPT answers are very good. Others are completely worthless, particularly on, if they're asked a legal question, AI can't cope with concepts like reasonableness, which exists in British court cases, and they often get things wrong. And I find ChatGPT is better than the Google AI summaries you get if you put a question into Google. But some of them are all right, but you can't rely on them, and they definitely shouldn't be used for any legal issue. They can be, even on questions like, is this restaurant going to be open? Or is the tax office going to be open? I was checking this a couple of days ago, and it told me that the tax office, the Daňový úrad on Radlinského, was closed on Tuesdays and was opening on Wednesday morning. Well, if you went on its own website, that wasn't what it was saying. It was giving you even the extended opening hours for next week. So you can't really rely on AI for anything. You have to be able to question sources, and this is what I think students find increasingly difficult. I mean, I found when I was marking student essays 2 or 3 years ago that you would suddenly get an absurd internet source coming up in all the student essays in their footnotes, and they were basically quoting an essay written by a Russian master's student in Hungary. And I soon discovered why this source was coming up. If you put the essay title I had written into Google, this was the first source that came up. So I had to explain to all the students that why do you strengthen your case by quoting this person when he's just an MA student and has no authority? This source doesn't matter. And it's getting, just because something is published on the internet, it doesn't mean that it is correct or worth publishing.
So internet as your only source may not be a right way to learn and be informed about the politics, right?
Yes.
But then going back to, we have not a lot of choice beside looking at what we have at internet. And when we follow someone, an expert like John Mearsheimer, what do you suggest after watching? And there are a lot of some great episodes out there, and I'm guilty of listening to some of them. And to be very frank, Karen, when I listen to him, not knowing the full depth and the perspectives that you have, it does impress at the surface for listeners like me who want to learn, but we are, if we want to go deep into this, do you suggest that there are other resources that we should look for, or there are equally not contrasting, but we should also look at the other side of the philosophy as compared to John?
I mean, for example,
are there more names that we should
if you're
look
looking
for?
at a Mearsheimer interview, there's a huge difference between a passive questioner asking him questions and an interviewer interviewing him, and somebody who thinks something completely different, who is going to give expert, educated counter arguments at the same time.
Yeah.
And I can remember
so good political debate is a good thing to watch, rather than...
Yes, I can remember somebody giving me an interesting argument about something, and I looked at the internet source he told me of this person speaking, and it was quite interesting, but then I immediately looked up to find out what the counter arguments were, and it said, well, he only used this source and he used that survey, and actually the counter evidence says this, this and this, and you have to have both sides, and as I say, there are simply a lot of examples now of politicians saying things that aren't true. I mean, we knew this with Trump. I mean, Trump was coming up with ridiculous things like stating President Obama wasn't born in the United States, so shouldn't have been president. Absurd lies that were easily checkable and verifiable. But once you have politicians thinking they can get away with it and realising that some of their core electorate do not care, then you have a problem.
Well said. No, I totally agree. And Karen, I think what the takeaway from this is that understanding politics is not merely about having as much as possible information, as much information as you could gather, but being able to question that, being able to think, being able to be comfortable with having a counter theory and counter argument to that.
I mean, people have sent me YouTube videos of someone speaking and said, listen to this, you'll find it, really interesting, a 15, 20 minute
done
interview.
the same sometimes.
And the first thing I do is look the person up and discover if they're worth 20 minutes of my time. And I usually discover, that this person...
it's a one-sided conversation.
Well, or in one case, somebody sent me an interview, and I discovered that it was a former lawyer who had been struck off from being a lawyer in Britain for having lied in court. So I'm really not going to spend 15 or 20 minutes of my time listening to his opinion on anything.
So just as we come towards the end, I think I'll move away to a bit a personal question here. Being a professor, being a political scientist, what do you think of the current generation of students who choose to study political science in the universities and colleges, and how is political science as a subject, as a faculty, being perceived today? Is it different than before? And I'll tell you why I'm asking this, Karen, is because political science, in my times when we were choosing our majors and subjects to choose after school, it was part of the arts faculty and often seemed to be like, it's one of the easy subjects. If you're not able to get into science and engineering and medicine, it could be a relief that you will always find subjects like philosophy and political science to pick from. But now when I see this, I feel that political science has elevated in terms of its significance. Would you like to share your thoughts on this?
It varies from where you are and who you're talking to. I find if I tell people that I'm a lecturer in politics. Most ordinary people, oh, that's complicated, you know. A lot of students see it simply as something that's interesting. In Slovakia, I think students regard it as a subject that will be useful. I think there's still a feeling in Slovakia that if you study politics, you might get a good job in a nice international organisation like the EU, because Slovakia is a fairly small country. It's slightly easier to get a job in the EU than if you come from a large country. And there's a feeling that a political scientist is going to work in a ministry or for a local council. I think in Britain there's more a feeling that a political scientist is someone who can evaluate arguments and present competing facts and reach a balanced conclusion. So, for example, if you're a consultancy firm, somebody who's studied politics probably has the sort of mind that you're looking for, because they're weighing up arguments. A political scientist has studied power structures, so they may be able to work out in diverse circumstances what is happening and how you manage to get something done and get an opinion through. So and also a political scientist ought to be able to weigh out facts and sources and discover what is reliable and what isn't. They can research sources. So,
and hence it's a science. There's a lot of science behind. Karen, you've mentioned EU. We've talked about it. We are in EU. Given the current world affairs, where do you see EU stands in terms of stability, in terms of safety? We are both, let's say, a long-term citizen of this country, and we will plan to live here in the near future. Do you think this is something we should think about? Should we get worried? What's your last parting thoughts on this?
Is being in an EU country a guarantee of safety and
stability? In general, the future of
I think it is. I mean, sometimes I've been quite critical of the EU. I'm quite interested. You know, before an election, say European Parliament election, you get these little surveys you can fill in. Which party should I vote for?
Yes.
And I remember I suppose it was 2015, I filled in one of these questionnaires, and it told me I should vote for the United Kingdom Independence Party in Britain, Nigel Farage's anti-EU party, simply because I had occasionally expressed doubts or reservations about EU policy and hadn't meekly accepted every pro-EU statement automatically. And I found this very interesting because you know from what I've said earlier in this interview that I was very much opposed to Brexit and believed it was founded on lies. But just because I believed that being in the EU was definitely advantageous for Britain, it didn't mean I should accept everything the EU says. And I occasionally think political science research on the EU, a lot of which unfortunately is financed by the EU, it tends to want to prove that people are very similar to each other, and that, you know, it's a bit like the communists tried to prove that the younger generation were more convinced about communism and socialism than the older generation. And the EU wants to prove that people are becoming more alike, and they're approving of, you know, if you read a Eurobarometer survey, it always highlights at the top any finding that people are more accepting of this EU policy than they had been a few years ago. if you're really going to be a strong, sustainable organisation, you have to look at the negative. You have to understand that there are some issues where in different EU member states, people view arguments differently, that the domestic politics impacts on views on the EU differently in different countries, but you're not actually encouraged by the EU to study why and how EU member states are different from each other, and that I think is a weakness for its sustainability. But generally, it's been an incredibly successful project, particularly in this area of Europe, and anybody, any government who thinks of leaving the EU is definitely damaging that country's chances. And if you look at how damaging it has been in Britain, which was one of the strongest countries, Britain probably had a better preconditions for surviving outside the EU than any other member state. And it's really hit the economy badly. So for a country like Slovakia, it would be a complete disaster. Even I think in Hungary and Poland, with the governments they have had in the past, people have known this as well.
Yeah. Well, so I think the takeaway from all of this, Karen, is that sometimes it's okay and acceptable to not have these quick, confident answers to understand politics. It's okay to be confused, like I am, to be curious, to think deeper, to research more, and sometimes I think it's okay to have people with different opinions, because it actually might help in thinking objectively and thinking balanced. So this was a great conversation, Karen, like always. So it was lovely talking to you, Karen. Thank you so much. You've written a book called Slovakia, Its Journey from Invisibility. Am I correct?
Escape
from Invisibility. Slovakia, it's Escape from Invisibility. Very interesting, very apt title. But we do wish to see the more recent work of yours. Yes. And I hope to invite you for the next chat when you will be publishing your next book.
Right, I'll do my best.
Thanks. Thank you so much. And again, to my audience, if you love this conversation like I did, please do not forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.